Bad spellings are literally everywhere.
Newspapers, books, mail, even billboards. But if you were to take a look at a language like Spanish, Turkish, or Italian, languages whose phonologies aren't any simpler than our own, you find words that are spelt as they sound, something linguists would call phonemic orthography. But why can't this be the case for English?
To illustrate just how deficient and regrettable our orthography is, let me show you what English spelling looks like.
First we have the OUGH combination, probably the most infamous to anyone who's ever tried learning English as a second language. It can be pronounced in any of 7 different ways, 10 if you're counting the variant forms. There are also the silent letters, the GNs, KNs, as well as the silent Bs, Ns, silent Hs, the list goes on. In fact, the only letter in English that isn't silent is V.
And this isn't even the main problem. Many languages exist phonetically, even with these silent letters. The main issue with English spelling, the elephant in the room, is inconsistency. 1 or 2 systems would be fine, but in English, we have an absolute plethora. There are way too many random letters dotted throughout our dictionaries. Letters that each have their own unique excuses for being there.
And some words, it seems, are just spelled differently for fun.
But how did English spelling get so bad? How did we go from this to this?
Writing, spelling, everything, it all starts with the Sumerians, who about 5,000 years ago began to use styluses to poke these little signs into clay tablets, in a system known as cuneiform. Gradually, this system, which although initially pictographic, soon began to take on an alphabetic function, becoming so successful that it's used by the Akkadians, Babylonians, Hittites, Egyptians, Phoenicians, basically all the ancient civilizations. Eventually, the Romans, inspired by the Greeks, who were in turn inspired by the Phoenicians, began to use this, the Latin script which we all know and love. Well, almost. This underwent a few iterations until we get to 793, when the Vikings invaded, bringing over 2,000 new words to the language. And it was the merging of Anglo-Saxon with Old Norse which formed Old English. Over the next century, various Christian missionaries arrived, introduced literacy, and a hell of a lot of Latin. Initially, they tried to use the Latin alphabet, which back then only had 23 letters, to transcribe Old English, which had around 35 sounds. But eventually, they realized how impractical this was, and so used some of the glyphs from the old rune alphabet. That being said, they did spell things surprisingly phonetically. Things were going pretty much fine until the Normans arrived in 1066, spelling the end of anything close to a simple orthography for English. The Normans brought structure and hierarchy through their system of feudalism, with this also applying linguistically. The Saxons, who spoke their Germanic Old English, largely continued speaking the way they always had, whilst their Romance-speaking Norman invaders spoke a dialect of French. But the Normans have themselves a problem. Their language's sounds, and the way they fit together, are very different from the Anglo-Saxons. So how are they to write in Old English? Well, the Norman scribes decide that when they want to write in Anglo-Saxon, they'll simply write it as though it were French. This led to some of the following conventions. Oh, and also, the Normans had really bad handwriting, so some words were changed just to make them legible. So England ends up being an effectively trilingual nation, with Anglo-Saxon terms being the general down-to-earth form, French being the more formal, and Latin for very specific concepts.
For the most part though, people, depending on how they say things in their dialect, pretty much just spell as they want, leading to literally thousands of variant spellings. So great, we have 3-ish different spelling systems, all kind of merged into one. I mean, it could be worse.
Then in the 1350s, when the English begin to re-establish a national identity, it's writers like Chaucer and Tyndale who contribute heavily to the establishment of a consistent English spelling system. But they kinda failed, in the sense that since many people had previously written exclusively in Latin and French, they simply ignored this new spelling system and continued to spell according to the French rules. Then, in 1477, this guy, William Caxton, comes along and develops this, the printing press, an invention which would change spelling as we know it. Now he has a huge job, that of standardizing the entirety of the English language. You see, since the Norman invasion, English has not really been written and was only spoken by the Anglo-Saxon peasants. But now that this guy, Henry V, has made English the official language, how words are spelt becomes increasingly important. Caxton and his printers took their jobs quite seriously, adding e's to the end of words, encouraging the use of French-derived terms, and even incorporating some Flemish spelling conventions, which we see in words like ghastly and ghost. Although, this was largely undermined by the fact that the majority of London's printers were foreign, and often, quite sneakily, added extra letters to words, just to make extra money.
But then, something mad happens. For whatever reason, people start changing the way they pronounce vowels, in a process known as the Great Vow Shift, which, unlike the name suggests, also involves the altering of many consonant sounds. I'm sure you can already imagine what sort of problems this posed. Since printing is now a thing, people can't just change words to reflect pronunciation, so we end up with tons of redundant letters.
To add insult to injury, the Renaissance saw academics altering spellings to reflect words' Latin origins, further complicating things. Then, arriving at the 18th century, there were these two guys, Samuel Johnson and Noah Webster, both dictionary makers, but with very different ideas about how words should be spelled. Johnson used the OUR trigraph for words like colour, reflecting the French spelling, and RE for words like centre. Whilst on the other side of the pond, Webster used the older OR spelling for colour, and the ER spelling for words like centre. Although these changes were small, they led to tons of later innovations, which ultimately set British and American orthography on different trajectories. The final change to English spelling came through the 19th century, a time of rapid scientific and technological advancements. It's at this time where we get the CH sound in words like chaos. This change means that we now have 3 different pronunciations of this digraph.
But if spelling in English is so bad, why don't we just reform it? Well, while researching this video, I came across a number of organisations, like the Simplified Spelling Board and the Simplified Spelling Society, who've both tried to promote more phonemically accurate systems for transcribing English, as shown here and here. But I think these organisations are missing something quite important. English has hundreds of different varieties, with radically different vowel systems. so it would be ridiculously impractical to have a different orthography for each and every one of them. Notwithstanding the fact that no system represents how words are pronounced in a truly phonemic fashion. There's also the argument that spelling homophones differently aids learning by giving us families of words with similar meanings.
Ultimately though, linguistic innovation is always faster than any writing system can keep up with. And even if we were to reform English today, we would need multiple reforms over the next few centuries.
So yeah, that's the full story of how English spelling got so bad. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tune in next week.